He married her in front of 400 people and walked away before the music even started. No dance, no photograph, no whispered word. Just the sound of his shoes on marble and the doors closing behind him, leaving his bride standing alone in a room full of strangers, wearing her best smile like a wound. Charlotte Hayes had agreed to this marriage for one reason and one reason only. And that reason was dying in a hospital bed across the city. She didn't want his name, his money, or his empire. She wanted to keep a promise to the woman who had loved her when no one else did. What she got instead was 8 months of silence that would either break her completely or rebuild her into something her husband never saw coming. If this story already has your attention, hit that like button right now. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And don't you dare touch that screen until the very last word. The morning of the wedding, Vincent Moreau stood at the window of his corner office on the 42nd floor of the Moreau building and watched the Chicago skyline like a man memorizing something he expected to lose. The lake was steel gray that October. The wind came off the water in long, flat waves that rattled the glass. He'd been awake since 4. He had a meeting at 7 with his consigliere, Marco Ricci, who had been with the Moreau family for longer than Vincent had been alive. Marco was 63, built like a refrigerator that had been through a war, and entirely incapable of softening bad news. He'd delivered it straight since day one, and Vincent had always respected him for it. "You're really going through with this," Marco said. It wasn't a question. Vincent didn't turn from the window. "She's asking for one thing. One. She's asking you to marry a stranger because she's sentimental, and you're too loyal to tell her no. Don't." The word landed hard, short, final. Marco set his coffee down on the desk and folded his hands. The girl doesn't know what she's walking into. That's a problem. She knows exactly what she's walking into. Vincent turned then, and his face was the same face he wore at every negotiation. Flat, unreadable, giving nothing away. "I'll provide for her. She'll want for nothing. What she won't get is a performance." "So you're going to marry a woman and treat her like a tenant?" "I'm going to fulfill a dying woman's wish and keep the rest of my life exactly as it is." Marco picked up his coffee again. He said nothing else. He'd worked for Vincent long enough to understand the difference between a decision and a conversation. Evelyn Moreau had been sick since February. By October, she was in the kind of condition where the doctors used words like comfortable and quality of remaining time in the same sentences they used to describe medication schedules. She was 79. She had raised Vincent from the age of 14 after a car accident on I-90 killed both his parents on a Tuesday night in November, and she had never once let him believe his life was ruined by what happened. She had been precise, demanding, occasionally ruthless, and entirely devoted to him. She was the only person on earth he trusted completely. She had met Charlotte Hayes 3 years earlier through the Moreau Cultural Foundation, a legitimate operation that funded historic preservation and arts programming across the Chicago metropolitan area. Charlotte had come in as a volunteer consultant, an art history professor from the University of Chicago with a specialty in 19th century American civic architecture. She had no interest in the family's other operations. She came to the foundation because she believed in the work. She stayed because Evelyn recognized something in her worth keeping close. Vincent had known about Charlotte in the abstract. Name on briefings. Face at foundation events he didn't attend. He'd done his due diligence the way he did due diligence on everyone. Background search, financial history, professional reputation. Nothing alarming, nothing interesting. A quiet academic with student loan debt she was slowly paying down, a small apartment in Hyde Park, and a professional record clean enough to eat off of. He hadn't been curious about her beyond that. Then Evelyn had called him to her room at the hospital and made her request with the same directness she'd applied to everything in her life. "Sit down," she'd said. "I'm going to ask you something and I need you to hear it before you refuse." He sat. She told him about Charlotte, not the professional version, the human version, the woman who drove her to specialist appointments when the foundation staff didn't know she was sick, who brought soup that actually tasted like something, who sat beside her bed and read aloud from a biography of Louis Sullivan without being asked. The woman who had become, somewhere in the last 3 years without anyone formally declaring it, something like family. Evelyn had looked at him from the hospital pillow with eyes that still had all their sharpness, even when the rest of her was failing, and said, "I want to know she'll be taken care of when I'm gone." I want to know she has someone, and I want you to be that someone, because you need it more than she does, and you're too stubborn to admit it." He'd almost said no. The word was right there at the front of his mouth, but it was Evelyn, and she was dying, and she had never in 20 years asked him for a single thing. So he said yes. Charlotte's first instinct when Evelyn had raised the idea with her had been an immediate and polite refusal. She'd sat in that hospital room holding a paper cup of lukewarm tea and told the woman she loved like a grandmother that this was not the kind of thing sensible people did anymore, that arranged marriages between strangers were not a solution to loneliness, and that Vincent Moreau, from every account she'd ever heard, was not the kind of man who needed or wanted a wife. He needed a business associate with better paperwork. Evelyn had listened to all of it. Then she'd said, "You're afraid he won't want you." Charlotte had put the tea down. "I'm afraid he already doesn't." "He doesn't want anyone," Evelyn said. "That's the problem you'd be solving." It took 3 more visits, 2 long phone calls, and 1 very honest conversation about what Charlotte actually wanted from her own life before she finally agreed. And she agreed on a condition. She would try, genuinely try. She would enter the marriage with honesty and give it real effort. But she was not going to beg. She was not going to perform. And if the man couldn't meet her halfway after she'd extended every good faith gesture she had, she was going to walk away without guilt. Evelyn had accepted those terms. The wedding was held at the Drake Hotel on a Saturday afternoon. 400 guests, mostly family connections, business associates, a smattering of city officials who owed the Moreau family favors going back decades. The flowers were white peonies and dark eucalyptus. The string quartet was impeccable. Charlotte wore a dress that her best friend Maya had helped her choose. Ivory silk with clean lines, nothing theatrical, nothing that tried too hard. She stood at the end of the aisle and watched Vincent Moreau come toward her and tried to read something human in his face. There was nothing there to read. He was tall, 6'2", maybe more. Dark hair cut short, the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved with a specific and humorless intention. He wore the suit the way men in his position wore everything, like it was armor that happened to be expensive. His eyes were dark, and they moved over her with the same professional efficiency she imagined he applied to real estate inspections. Not cold exactly, but entirely, completely absent of warmth. He took her hand at the altar. His grip was firm and brief and utterly impersonal. The officiant spoke. Vincent answered when required. Charlotte answered when required. The words were exchanged with the bureaucratic precision of a property transfer. And then it was done. The guests applauded. Charlotte turned toward her new husband with a smile that she had prepared carefully and practiced twice in the mirror that morning. Not performed, just controlled. The kind of smile that said, "I'm not going to let this break me in front of 400 people." Vincent looked at her for 2 full seconds. Something moved behind his eyes, too fast to name, too brief to hold on to. Then he said quietly and without particular cruelty, "I have something to handle," and he walked away. Not to the reception line, not to the table, not to any visible destination. He simply turned and walked, and the crowd parted around him the way crowds always did for men like Vincent Moreau, and in 30 seconds he was gone. Charlotte stood alone in the middle of the ballroom floor while the string quartet transitioned smoothly into the first reception song, and 400 people tried very hard not to look directly at her. Maya appeared at her shoulder inside of a minute. Her voice was low and controlled, but her jaw was tight. "Charlotte, I'm fine. I know what it was." Charlotte kept the smile where it was, adjusted the grip on her bouquet. "Get me a glass of wine and don't make a face at anyone." She got through the reception the way you got through anything that was too large to absorb all at once, by breaking it into pieces small enough to manage. She spoke to his cousins. She thanked the guests. She ate half her dinner. She told 3 different people that Vincent had been called away by something urgent, a family matter, nothing to worry about. He sent his regards. She did not cry. She would not cry. Not in that room, not in front of those people, not over a man who had decided before he ever spoke 10 words to her that she wasn't worth the effort of a single dance. She kept the promise she'd made to Evelyn right up until the last guest left. Then she got in the car and she let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. It settled in her chest like something calcified, not grief exactly, not rage. something closer to the particular loneliness of learning that your worst fear about yourself was correct. He saw her. He looked right at her, and he walked away. The Moreau estate sat on 11 acres in Lake Forest, 40 minutes north of the city. Charlotte had been given a tour of the house a week before the wedding by Marco Ricci, who had conducted the walkthrough with the energy of a man explaining fire codes. Her rooms were on the second floor east wing with windows that faced the garden, separate from Vincent's rooms by a sitting room and a hallway that might as well have been a continent. She unpacked her own boxes. The staff offered to help. 3 of them appeared at her door within the first hour, nervous, clearly unsure of the protocol, and she thanked them genuinely and sent them away. She needed to do this part herself. Needed the physical activity of putting her books on shelves and her photographs on the desk to feel like she still had some agency over her own existence. She started cooking breakfast the next morning at 7. She made it for 2. Vincent didn't come down. She ate alone, left his portion covered on the stove, and went to work. She did the same thing the next day, and the next. She learned his schedule from the household calendar that Marco reluctantly shared with her. Not the sensitive details, just the rhythms, the times he was usually home, the meals he occasionally took at the house when he wasn't in the city. She adapted around those rhythms without announcing she was doing it. She left notes about morning meetings near his coffee. She remembered that his cousin Danny had a bad knee and asked after it when Danny visited. She learned that the head of household staff, a woman named Rosa, had been with the family for 17 years and quietly asked her how things had actually been done before she arrived, because she didn't want to disrupt what was already working. The household warmed to her within weeks. Rosa became almost protective. Danny started dropping by more often than his schedule required, and Charlotte suspected it had something to do with the fact that she made an excellent pasta. The estate, which had operated with the emotional temperature of a well-managed hotel, began to feel incrementally more like a place where people actually lived. Vincent observed none of this, or if he observed it, he gave no indication. He was present in the house the way weather was present. You knew it was there, it affected everything, but it didn't engage with you. He moved through rooms she'd recently been in and ate meals she'd quietly had Rosa set out and wore the clothes that appeared in his closet, with apparently no curiosity about who had arranged to have them cleaned. He wasn't hostile. He wasn't anything. He was simply not there, even when he was standing in the same room. By the 3rd month, Charlotte had accepted that she was living alone inside a marriage. By the 4th, she had stopped leaving notes near his coffee. By the 5th month, on a morning in March when the light through the kitchen windows was the particular thin gray of a Chicago winter refusing to end, Charlotte sat with her cup and her book and realized that she had forgotten, somewhere in the last several months, to miss the version of her life that existed before this one. And that was the most disturbing thing that had happened to her since the wedding day. Not the humiliation, not the silence, not the 800 small daily proofs that she was invisible to the man she'd married. The fact that she had shrunk enough to stop expecting more. She closed the book, finished the coffee, and picked up her phone to call the chair of the university's Historic Preservation Committee about a project she'd been putting off for reasons she now recognized as having nothing to do with the project. She was going back to work, real work, all of it. The project was a civic survey of underrepresented 19th century commercial architecture in the near West Side. 3 square miles of buildings that had been overlooked in every major preservation study for the last 40 years, because they didn't fit the dominant narrative of Chicago's architectural identity. Charlotte had been building the conceptual framework for this research for 2 years. She threw herself into it with the specific energy of a person who has rediscovered that their own intelligence is the most reliable thing they own. She started arriving on campus before 8. She took meetings that ran past dinner. She published 2 preliminary essays in a journal that mattered and received responses from scholars in 3 other cities. She gave a talk at the Chicago Architecture Foundation that drew a standing room audience and a write-up in 2 local publications. Away from the estate, Charlotte Hayes remembered exactly who she was. The charity gala was in April, a fundraiser for the Landmarks Preservation Council, black tie, held in the grand ballroom of the Civic Opera House. Charlotte attended as a speaker. She gave 8 minutes on the value of commercial vernacular architecture and got a longer ovation than the keynote, which she would later describe to Maya as one of the more gratifying professional moments of her adult life. Afterward, standing near the bar with a glass of wine she'd genuinely earned, She was approached by a man she didn't know who introduced himself as Nathan Cole. He was 40, lean, with the kind of quiet energy that came from spending a lot of time working with his hands on things that mattered to him. He was an architect, restoration work, mostly, historic commercial and civic structures. He'd heard her talk and had a specific question about a building on West Monroe that he'd been retained to survey. The question was good, technical, precise, showing he'd actually listened. She answered it. He followed up. She followed up on his follow-up. 20 minutes went by. Somewhere across the ballroom, in a section of the room Charlotte wasn't looking at, Vincent Moreau stood with a glass of scotch and watched his wife laugh at something another man had said. It was the first time in 7 months that he had seen her laugh like that. Unguarded, real, the kind of laughter that moved through a person from somewhere genuine. He felt it like a wire pulled tight in his chest. He didn't understand, standing there with the ice shifting in his glass, why that sound, her laugh from across a crowded room, directed at a man he didn't know, had gotten through every wall he'd spent 20 years building. He told himself it was territorial, a reflex, something biological and therefore irrelevant. But the wire didn't go slack. And across the ballroom, Charlotte said goodnight to Nathan Cole and walked back toward the exit without once looking in her husband's direction. Not because she was making a point, but because the thought of looking for him hadn't occurred to her. That was the thing that kept Vincent standing at the bar long after his scotch was gone. She hadn't looked for him. Not once. Not even as a reflex. 7 months ago, she had looked for him in the middle of a ballroom with 400 people watching, and he had already been gone. And now, finally, now that she had stopped looking, he was the one who couldn't take his eyes off her. The morning after the gala, Vincent arrived at the kitchen at 7:15 and found the coffee already made. Not left for him. Not arranged with a note the way it used to be in those early months when Charlotte had tried everything she knew how to try. Just made. A full pot, still hot, because she had made it for herself, and there happened to be enough for two. The distinction was invisible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. Vincent had started paying attention too late, but he was paying it now. He poured a cup and stood at the counter and listened to the house. Her footsteps on the floor above him, the sound of a door, water running, the particular rhythm of someone moving through a morning with complete self-sufficiency, not waiting for anything or anyone. He drank the coffee standing up and didn't sit down because sitting down felt like an admission he wasn't ready to make. Marco arrived at 8 with the week's security reports and found him still in the kitchen. Marco looked at the coffee pot, looked at Vincent, said nothing about either. They went through the reports in the study. 3 items needed decisions. Vincent made them clean and fast, the way he always did, and Marco noted them and moved on. They were 20 minutes in when Marco set his pen down with the particular deliberateness that meant he was about to say something Vincent wasn't going to like. Danny says she gave a talk last week at the Architecture Foundation, standing room. I know. You know because you had someone pull the event coverage, or you know because you were there? Vincent looked at him. Asking, Marco said, because those are 2 different things. I know because Rosa mentioned it. He picked up the next report. She got a write-up in 2 publications. She's making a name for herself outside the family. That's not a problem. Didn't say it was. Marco picked up his pen again. Just noting that the woman you married appears to be doing considerably better than the arrangement you offered her. Marco. I'll shut up. Now would be good. Marco shut up. But the pen moved across the notepad slowly, the way it did when he was thinking something through and choosing not to say it, which was sometimes worse than just hearing it. That afternoon, Vincent drove himself into the city. No driver, no tail, which was a decision Marco would have objected to loudly if he'd known about it. He had a meeting at 2 with the family's real estate council about a development in the South Loop, and after the meeting he sat in the car in the parking structure on Wabash for 12 minutes doing nothing, which was not something he did. He drove past the University of Chicago on the way home. He didn't stop. He just drove the extra 4 miles down South Ellis and looked at the buildings and thought about a woman sitting in one of them right now, surrounded by people who actually listened to her, and felt the wire in his chest pull tighter. He went home. Charlotte was in the garden when he got back, sitting on the stone bench near the east wall, with a laptop and a stack of photographs spread out on the seat beside her. She was on the phone. A work call. something technical about surveying methodology and zoning record access. She didn't look up when his car came down the drive. Not because she was ignoring him, because she genuinely didn't register him. He stood at the window of the ground floor study for approximately 45 seconds, watching her talk with her hands while she held the phone, photographs shuffling as she found the one she needed, and felt something he could not name settle into the base of his throat like a stone. Then he went upstairs and worked until midnight. The collaboration between Charlotte and Nathan Cole began the following week. It was entirely professional and entirely above board. She had the archival and historical expertise, he had the structural assessment background and the active restoration contracts, and the Near West Side survey required both. They met twice a week at a workspace she kept at the university, and once a week in the field, walking the block faces of West Monroe and West Adams with clipboards and camera equipment, arguing cheerfully about whether a particular cornice treatment was Italianate or Renaissance Revival, while Nathan's junior associate took measurements. Charlotte was productive in a way she hadn't been in almost a year. The research was good. The collaboration was clean. Nathan asked precise questions, accepted her expertise without condescension, disagreed with her occasionally in ways that improved the work, and made her feel, for the first time in a very long time, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. He also made her laugh on a Tuesday afternoon in May when they were standing in front of a 6-story building on West Monroe in a light rain, and he delivered an entirely straight-faced assessment of the building's decorative limestone work as looking like a Beaux-Arts building that got into an argument with a grocery store and lost. And Charlotte laughed so hard she had to put her hand on the brick wall to steady herself. She told Maya about it that night over the phone. "Is he attractive?" Maya asked. "That's not the point. The fact that you didn't say no is a point. He's a colleague, a good one. The work is excellent." "Charlotte." "Maya." "You're allowed to notice." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "I notice. And then I remember that I'm married to a man who looked at me on our wedding day and decided I wasn't worth the effort of a single conversation, and I stopped noticing. That's not healthy either." "I know." She looked at the ceiling of her study. "I'm not doing anything wrong." "I know you're not." Maya's voice went quieter. "I just want you to be careful with your own heart, because I've watched you give it away to things that don't give back, and you're very good at convincing yourself that's enough." Charlotte didn't have an answer for that. She said goodnight and sat in the quiet of her room and listened to the estate settle around her, the particular large house silence of too many rooms with too few people in them, and did not let herself think too long about what Maya had said. Vincent found out about the collaboration through the household schedule. Charlotte had started keeping her work calendar on the shared estate system, mostly for Rosa's benefit, so the staff knew when she'd be home for dinner. And Vincent had begun checking it with a regularity that he would not have admitted to anyone. He saw Nathan Cole's name appear twice in a single week, then 3 times the following week. He ran the name through his own channels the same night, the way he ran every unfamiliar name that entered his orbit, and got back a file that told him everything. Architect, 40 years old, clean record, solid professional reputation, 2 completed restoration projects that had won preservation awards, currently contracted on 3 active sites across Chicago. Nothing in the file was alarming. Everything about the file made the stone in his throat heavier. He came down to breakfast the next morning at 7. Charlotte was already there reading something on her tablet, coffee cup halfway to her mouth. She looked up when he came in. Her expression shifted, not warming exactly, but adjusting, recalibrating to his presence the way you adjusted to a change in weather. "Morning," she said. Neutral, precise. "Morning." He went to the coffee, poured a cup, stayed at the counter longer than necessary. "How's the survey going?" She looked at him for a moment. He couldn't tell if she was deciding whether to answer or deciding how. "Well," she said finally, "we found 2 buildings last week that aren't in any of the existing documentation. Pre-1880 commercial construction, mostly intact. It's significant." "Who's we?" The pause was very small. Most people wouldn't have noticed it. "Nathan Cole, the architect I'm collaborating with on the structural assessment component." She set her tablet down. Her voice was level. "You'd have seen his name on the calendar." "I did." She looked at him steadily. "Is there something you want to ask me, Vincent?" The directness of it caught him off guard. Not the question, the tone. Calm. No defensiveness, no preemptive apology, no shrinking. She was asking him to say the thing plainly or not say it at all, and she was entirely prepared for either answer. He made himself hold the look. No. Okay. She picked up her tablet again. The survey presentation is in 6 weeks. I'll be working late most nights until then. I know, I saw the calendar. She nodded once and went back to reading. He sat down across from her. He didn't know why he sat down. He had nowhere specific to be for another hour. He drank his coffee and looked at the table and was aware, in a way that was unpleasant and new, that he was the stranger in this room, that she had built a version of this morning, coffee, quiet, work, that functioned perfectly without him, and his presence in it was simply a variable she was accommodating with the same efficient grace she applied to everything. He had done that to her. He understood it now. He had treated her like a variable for 8 months, and now he didn't know how to be anything else to her. Danny showed up at the estate that Friday with a bottle of wine and no real reason to visit, which meant he had a reason he hadn't decided how to say yet. Vincent let him in, and they sat in the study, and Danny talked about 3 things that didn't matter before he got to the thing that did. She seems good, Danny said. Charlotte, she is. You see her new piece in the Preservation Journal, the one about the West Side Survey? Not yet. Danny looked at him. Danny was 38 and had Vincent's coloring and none of Vincent's economy with expression. Everything he felt moved across his face freely, which was occasionally useful and often inconvenient. Right now his face was doing the thing it did when he thought Vincent was being an idiot and was trying to decide how to phrase it. You want to tell me what you're thinking? Danny said. Not particularly. Because from where I'm standing, Danny, it looks like you married someone remarkable and spent 8 months treating her like furniture, and now that she's found her footing, you've decided you're interested, and I just want to make sure you understand how that looks from the outside. The room was very quiet. I know how it looks, Vincent said. Do you know what she told Rosa? Rosa told me this, okay? I'm not digging around. Charlotte told Rosa, in the first week she was here, that she wasn't going to disrupt anything that was already working because she was a guest in a house that had its own history, and she wanted to respect that. Danny set his wine glass down. A guest. She called herself a guest in her own home because you made her feel like one. Vincent said nothing. And now she's got a life. She's got her work and her research, and apparently she's got a colleague who thinks she's the most interesting person in any given room, which... Danny stopped himself, started again. I'm just saying, if you let this one go the way you let everything else go, I'm not going to be able to explain it to Grandma Evelyn if she asks me. Grandma Evelyn is in the hospital. I know where she is. Danny's voice went quiet. I also know she's running out of time to ask me things. The mention of Evelyn landed the way it always did, somewhere that didn't have a clean name. Vincent stood up and went to the window. The garden was dark outside, the stone bench where Charlotte sat with her laptop now empty and wet from earlier rain. Go home, Danny. Vinny, go home. Come back Sunday. I'll have Rosa make lunch. Danny went. Vincent stayed at the window for a long time after. It was Marco who finally broke it open, on a Thursday morning in early June, when he arrived at the estate earlier than usual with an expression that meant something had already gone wrong before anyone had been awake long enough to prevent it. He closed the study door behind him and put a manila envelope on the desk. Don't ask me how I found it, Marco said. And don't be angry that I was looking, because I wasn't looking for this specifically. Vincent looked at the envelope. Didn't touch it. Evelyn's desk, Marco said. The one from her study here, the one that went into storage when she moved to the hospital. The estate manager had it brought up to air out the room. I was checking the inventory. Vincent picked up the envelope. Inside were 3 letters, handwritten. Charlotte's handwriting. He'd seen enough of her notes in the early months to recognize the particular forward lean of it, the way she formed her lowercase letters. The letters were addressed to Evelyn. He read the first one standing up. It was dated 14 months ago, 4 months before the wedding was proposed. Charlotte was writing to decline an invitation to a foundation event, but the last paragraph drifted into something more personal. She was talking about the conversation Evelyn had apparently started raising in private, the idea of a match, an arrangement, a marriage. Charlotte was gentle but clear. She didn't want to marry a man who didn't want her. She'd watched enough people do exactly that to understand what it cost. She respected Evelyn too much to pretend she could be happy in a marriage built on obligation. He read the second letter. dated 9 months ago, 2 months before the wedding. Charlotte was still declining, more firmly this time, though still with love, still with the specific warmth she apparently reserved for Evelyn even when she was saying no. She wrote that she had no interest in the Moreau name or the Moreau money, or the influence that came with either. She had built her own life carefully, and she intended to keep it. She was not, and would never be, the kind of woman who married someone for security. He read the third letter. It was dated 6 weeks before the wedding. The handwriting was slightly different here, less controlled, more immediate, like it had been written fast or written through something. She wrote that she'd said yes. She wrote that she didn't fully understand why, except that Evelyn was dying, and Charlotte could not find a version of herself that was willing to deny a dying woman the thing that might let her leave in peace. She wrote that she was terrified. She wrote that she was going to try anyway because the alternative was standing at the edge of something and choosing the safer shore, and she had promised herself a long time ago she would stop doing that. She wrote, "I know he doesn't want me. I've accepted that. What I haven't accepted is the possibility that I might convince myself that not being wanted is what I deserve. So I'm going in with my eyes open, Evelyn. I'm going to try. And if it breaks me, at least it'll break me towards something instead of away." Vincent stood in his study holding a letter written by his wife 6 weeks before their wedding, in which she had laid out with complete clarity that she was walking into the worst-case version of her own life out of love for his grandmother. And he felt something move through him that was not an emotion he had a ready category for. It was too large and too specific, and it went too deep for any word he had in his ordinary vocabulary. He had spent 8 months believing Charlotte Hayes had married him for the proximity to power, the way every other person in his orbit circled it. He had built the entire architecture of his indifference on that assumption. It had felt like self-protection. It had felt like intelligence. It had been nothing. It had been the stupidest mistake of his life, dressed up as caution. She had entered his house with a broken heart and a promise to try, and he had given her 8 months of nothing in return. 8 months of empty chairs at breakfast tables and unmarked notes, and the particular cruelty of a man who treats a woman's genuine effort like background noise. And she had rebuilt herself anyway, without him, around him, in spite of him. He set the letters down on the desk very carefully, the way you set something down when you're not sure your hands are steady enough to be trusted with it. He sat. Across the estate, in the east wing, he could hear, faintly, through 2 walls and a hallway, the sound of Charlotte on a phone call. Her work voice. Professional, focused, completely contained. She had stopped needing him to validate any part of her existence, and he was only now, finally, beginning to understand what he had lost by never offering to. The wire in his chest that had started at the gala pulled so tight he stopped breathing for a moment. Then it snapped, and what replaced it was something much worse. The specific, undeniable weight of a man who has run out of reasons to keep lying to himself, standing in the wreckage of his own making, with no earthly idea whether the person he'd damaged most still had anything left to give him, or whether he had simply waited too long to find out. He sat in that chair for a long time. The letters were still on the desk in front of him, arranged in the order he'd read them, edges aligned the way his hands had automatically straightened them without his mind giving the instruction. Outside the study window, the garden was doing something with morning light that he wasn't looking at. The coffee Rosa had brought in at 8:30 had gone cold at his elbow. He hadn't touched it. 3 letters. 14 months of a woman telling the truth while he built an entire architecture of contempt on a lie he'd invented himself. He thought about the first morning after the wedding. Charlotte's breakfast left covered on the stove. He'd come down at 9, seen it, and walked past it to get a protein bar from the pantry because eating the food she'd made felt like accepting something he hadn't agreed to. He had told himself at the time that he was being clear. Setting the correct expectation, refusing to let the arrangement drift into something it wasn't. He had told himself a great many things. The intercom on the desk buzzed once. Rosa's voice. "Mr. Moreau, Mrs. Moreau is leaving for the university. She wanted me to tell you she won't be home for dinner." "Thank you, Rosa." He listened to the sound of Charlotte's car leaving the drive, the particular crunch of gravel, then the smooth shift to asphalt, then nothing. He picked up the letters and read them again, all 3. More slowly this time, stopping at the lines he'd moved past too fast the first time. In the second letter, there was a sentence he'd glossed over. "I've met him twice at foundation events. He's not what people say he is. I don't mean that as a compliment or a criticism. I mean, I can't read him, and I've never met anyone I couldn't eventually read. That frightens me more than anything else about this. She had been frightened of him. She had walked in frightened and tried anyway. He set the letters down. Then he stood up, put on his jacket, and drove to the hospital. Evelyn's room was on the 4th floor of Northwestern Memorial, a private room with a window that faced north. She'd been moved here 6 weeks ago when the outpatient management stopped being sufficient. She was awake when he arrived, which was not always the case in the afternoons now. She was smaller than she used to be. Not recently smaller, but over time smaller. The gradual diminishment of a large personality being slowly reduced to its essential architecture. The sharpness was still in her eyes. That hadn't gone anywhere. He sat in the chair beside the bed and put the letters on the blanket near her hand. She looked at them. She didn't look surprised. "You went through my desk," she said. "Marco did. He wasn't looking for them specifically." "No." She touched the edge of the top envelope with 2 fingers. "I meant to move them before the estate manager did the inventory. I forgot." She paused. "Or I didn't forget." Vincent looked at her. "I'm old," she said. "I'm allowed to be ambiguous about whether I forgot things." She said no. His voice came out even. He'd worked to make it even. 3 times. "She told you no 3 times and you kept asking." She said yes the 3rd time. "Because you were dying and she loved you and she couldn't find a way to refuse you." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Grandma, she told you she was walking in terrified. She told you she knew I didn't want her. You didn't know what you wanted. That's not the same as Vincent." Her voice was still capable of stopping him. 20 years and it still worked. "I did not manipulate that girl. I asked her, repeatedly. I told her every time that she could say no and I would understand and nothing between us would change. She made her own choice. She made her choice because she couldn't bear to disappoint you. And you made your choice because you couldn't bear to disappoint me either." She looked at him steadily. "So what's your actual complaint? That I asked 2 people I love to take a chance on each other?" "My complaint," he said carefully, "is that I spent 8 months treating her like she was there for the wrong reasons. I treated her like she was after something, like everyone's after something." He stopped. "She wasn't. She never was. And I knew on some level that didn't match the story I'd built. I knew she wasn't like that, and I kept the story anyway because it was easier." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "How is she?" she asked. The question was so simple it took him a second to process it. "Good," he said. She's more than good. She's built something outside the house, her research, her career. She's got a collaboration on a preservation survey that's getting real attention." He paused. "She's not waiting for me anymore." "Was she waiting for you before?" He thought about it honestly. "For about 5 months, yes." "And now?" "Now she's moved on to the part of her life that doesn't require me to show up." Evelyn looked at the window. The north light was flat and even and did nothing for the color of the room. "Then you have a problem," she said, "that is entirely of your own making, and I love you too much to pretend otherwise." He drove back to the estate in the kind of silence that has texture to it. Not empty silence. Silence with weight. He started the next morning. It was not dramatic. He didn't announce it, and he didn't make a speech, and he didn't leave a note. Because notes were what you left when you were still keeping your distance and managing things from a safe remove. He came down to the kitchen at 7, the same time Charlotte came down, and he sat at the table and said good morning and poured 2 cups of coffee and put one in front of her before she reached for the pot. She looked at the cup, looked at him, said nothing, sat down. They ate breakfast in the same room for the first time in 8 months, and the silence between them was different from every other silence they'd shared. Not comfortable, not yet, but no longer hostile. More like 2 people who had agreed to be in the same space without the prior terms of engagement. He asked about the survey. She answered carefully, watching him the way you watch something you'd been burned by before. Not aggressive, not cold, just careful, measuring the distance between what he was doing and what it might mean. He kept showing up. Every morning for the following 2 weeks, he was at the kitchen table by 7. He asked questions about her work when he had genuine questions and stayed quiet when he didn't. He stopped checking his phone during the stretches of silence. He told Rosa that dinner should be set for 2 at the table, not at separate stations the way it had been since January. Charlotte came to dinner. She was pleasant, professional, almost. She asked about his work in the careful way you asked about the work of someone you were trying to be fair to. Not invested, not indifferent, just fair. He accepted the fairness. He had not earned anything more than fairness. Danny noticed within a week. He came for Sunday lunch and sat across from Charlotte and watched her talk about a limestone cornice detail for 4 minutes with complete technical authority, and periodically glanced at Vincent with an expression that said he was cautiously revising his earlier assessment of the situation without being willing to say so out loud. It was on a Wednesday in late June that Vincent went to her university. He hadn't planned to. He had a meeting that ended early in Hyde Park, 2 blocks from campus, and he sat in the car afterward and looked at the building directory on his phone and found her schedule and made a decision before he'd consciously committed to making one. He stood at the back of a lecture hall with 200 seats and watched Charlotte Hayes teach. She was talking about the relationship between architectural patronage and civic identity in post-Civil War Chicago, a topic he knew nothing about and couldn't have cared less about 6 months ago. He stood with his back against the rear wall and watched her at the front of that room and understood for the first time the full dimension of what he'd been failing to see. She commanded that room, not loudly. She didn't perform, didn't inflate, didn't work for their attention the way some people worked for it. She simply knew things that mattered and communicated them with a clarity and precision that made the room go quiet and stay quiet. Students who looked like they'd arrived expecting to coast were leaning forward by the 20-minute mark. She stopped twice for questions, and the questions were good, which meant she'd built a room where people felt safe asking good questions, which was not an accident. He stood there for 45 minutes. She didn't see him. She was entirely focused on the work, on the students, on the ideas she was moving through that room like they were something worth handling carefully. He left before the lecture ended. He sat in his car and looked at his own hands on the steering wheel and tried to remember the last time he had felt genuinely humbled by another person's quality and came up empty, because the people in his world didn't typically display quality so much as they displayed the appearance of it, and he had become very good at telling the difference, and the difference here was that Charlotte Hayes was entirely real. He had kept her at the margins of his life for 8 months. He had been incurious about her, indifferent to her, systematically absent from every moment she had offered him. And in that same time, she had built something that stood on its own merits, in a world that had nothing to do with his name or his money or his reach. He drove home and ate dinner across from her and listened when she talked and did not say what he was thinking, because what he was thinking was too large and too late and required more than a dinner table to contain. It was Marco who brought the whole structure down. Not intentionally. Marco never did anything unintentionally, but this one came from a direction nobody had anticipated, which was the only kind of hit that actually landed. It was a Friday afternoon in early July. Vincent was in the study reviewing a property acquisition when Marco knocked and came in without waiting, which he only did when the information was time-sensitive. He put a photograph on the desk. It was taken that afternoon. Charlotte and Nathan Cole, standing in front of a building on West Adams, both in field clothes, both looking at something on a clipboard she was holding. Nathan's hand was near her shoulder. Not on it, near it. The kind of proximity that meant either nothing at all or the particular something of 2 people who had stopped being careful about casual contact. Charlotte was laughing. Vincent looked at the photograph for a long time. "Who took this?" he said. "One of our street-level people. Routine area coverage. It came up in the afternoon review." Marco's voice was entirely neutral. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm giving you the information. She's working with him. I know that. I know you know." Marco pulled the photograph back. "I'm not bringing it to you because I think there's something inappropriate happening. I'm bringing it because you've been sitting across from that woman at dinner every night for 2 weeks, and she doesn't know yet whether you're serious. And in the meantime, there is a man who has been paying attention to her since April, and he does not appear to be ambivalent." Vincent said nothing. "You took 8 months to look at your own wife," Marco said. "Other people have had considerably less time and used it better." He left the photo on the desk. Vincent looked at it for another minute. Then he turned it face down and went back to the property acquisition report and read the same paragraph 4 times without absorbing a single word of it. That evening at dinner, Charlotte mentioned entirely casually that the survey presentation had been moved up 2 weeks earlier than planned. The Landmarks Council had a grant deadline they were working around, and the presentation needed to happen in 3 weeks, which meant the next 2.5 weeks would be intensive. Late nights, weekend field work, probably some early mornings she'd warned Rosa about already. Nathan's got a structural report due to his own client the same week, she said, so we're going to have to overlap some of the field sessions. It's going to be tight. Vincent put his fork down. He didn't know he was going to say it until he was already saying it. Do you have feelings for him? The table went very quiet. Charlotte looked at him. Her expression didn't break and didn't harden. It went somewhere more difficult than either of those things. It went to a place that was clear and careful and entirely, specifically honest. Where is this coming from? She said. I'm asking you a direct question. And I'm asking you where it's coming from, because 2 weeks ago you didn't know his name and now you're… She stopped herself, set her fork down as well. The clink of it on the plate was very small in the quiet room. Nathan is a colleague. He's a good person and a good collaborator, and he has been a better friend to my confidence in the last 3 months than most people I've known for years. She looked at Vincent steadily. You want to know if I have feelings for him? Yes. You never asked who I was spending time with before. Her voice was level, completely level. For 8 months, I could have been having dinner with anyone, and you never once asked. The words hit him in a place he didn't have armor for, because he hadn't known he needed armor there. He said nothing. Charlotte picked up her fork again. She took one bite, set it down. Then she placed her napkin beside her plate with the precise, deliberate calm of a woman who has made a decision she's been building toward for some time, without knowing the exact moment it would arrive. I'm going to finish my dinner, she said quietly, and then I'm going to go upstairs and do 3 hours of work because the survey doesn't wait. And tomorrow morning I'm going to get up and make coffee and go to work and come home and have dinner and be perfectly civil to you, Vincent, because I am not a person who makes scenes or punishes people or performs her feelings in front of an audience. She looked at him one more time. Direct. No flinching. But I need you to understand something. I rebuilt my life inside your silence. I learned how to be complete inside a house where I was invisible. And what I will not do, what I am constitutionally, fundamentally incapable of doing, is dismantle what I built because you've decided after 8 months that you're curious about me. She picked up her fork again and finished her dinner. Vincent sat across from her and did not eat and did not speak, and felt the entire false floor of every excuse he'd ever given himself drop away beneath him simultaneously. 3 days later, on a Monday morning, when the light through the kitchen windows was the particular clear gold of early July, Charlotte came downstairs at 7:15 and placed a set of papers on the kitchen table beside his coffee cup. She didn't slam them down, she didn't make a moment of it. She set them down. The way you set down something that has been decided and does not require additional theater. Divorce papers. Vincent looked at them without touching them. Charlotte poured her own coffee and stood at the counter and said, in the same calm, unhurried voice she'd used 3 days ago, I've had them prepared for 3 weeks. I kept waiting to see if I was making the right decision. She paused. I kept waiting to see if what you were doing at breakfast every morning was real. It was real. I believe you. She looked at him directly. That's actually the hardest part. I believe you, and it's still too late. She picked up her coffee and her bag, and she walked out of the kitchen, and he heard the front door close behind her with a quiet, definitive click that was somehow worse than any slam could have been. Vincent sat at the kitchen table with the divorce papers in front of him, and his coffee going cold beside them, in the same kitchen where she had made breakfast alone for 5 months, and understood with a totality that left no room for negotiation. That the cost of being a man who kept himself unreachable was sitting right there in front of him in a neat stack of legal documents, and that the only person in the world who might have told him how to fix it was in a hospital bed across the city running out of time to tell him anything at all. He did not sign the papers. He did not move them. He did not put them in a drawer or pass them to his attorney or acknowledge them in any administrative way that would make the machinery begin turning. He left them exactly where Charlotte had placed them, on the kitchen table beside his cold coffee, and when Rosa came in 20 minutes later and saw them and looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who had worked for this family long enough to understand what she was looking at, he simply said, "Leave them." And Rosa left them. He sat in that kitchen for another hour. The problem with sitting still when your entire professional life has been built on motion, on the constant management of threat and leverage and counter-movement, is that stillness forces you to hear things you've been successfully outrunning. Vincent Moreau had been outrunning the same thing for 20 years. The specific silence that lived in the part of you that other people filled with connection, and he had filled with work and distance and the efficient management of everyone around him at arm's length. He heard it now, loud and clear and entirely unignorable. He got up, put on his jacket, told Rosa he'd be back by noon. He drove to the university. Charlotte had a 9 o'clock seminar that ran until 10:30. He knew this because he had been paying attention to her schedule for 3 weeks with an intensity that would have been useful 8 months ago and was now simply evidence of how late he was to every important moment of this marriage. He sat in the car in the visitor lot and waited and did not examine too closely what he planned to say because he didn't have a plan. He had a decision. The plan would have to build itself in real time. She came out of the building at 10:40, alone, bag over one shoulder, coffee in hand, the particular focused downward look of someone processing the session that had just ended. She was almost at the path that cut toward the library before she looked up and saw him standing beside his car. She stopped. The distance between them was about 30 feet, long enough that he could see her face shift through the calculation. Surprise. Then something harder. Then a kind of careful stillness that she'd gotten very good at. He walked toward her. She didn't move. "I didn't sign them," he said. "I see that." Her voice was measured. "That's your right. It's not about rights." "Vincent, I went to your lecture," he said, 6 weeks ago, the one at the Architecture Foundation. She blinked. "What?" "I stood at the back for 45 minutes. You didn't see me." He stopped 2 feet from her, close enough to talk, far enough that she didn't have to feel crowded. "I watched 200 people pay attention to you the way I should have been paying attention to you since October." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face that she controlled before it could become readable. "That doesn't change what the papers say," she said. "I know that. So what are you doing here?" "I don't know yet." He said it honestly, which was not something he said often, and she heard the honesty in it because she tilted her head very slightly. That micro-adjustment he'd learned meant she was listening harder than she was letting on. "I know I can't undo 8 months. I know I can't tell you that I've changed and expect you to believe it after 3 weeks of breakfast. I know what I did, what I didn't do, and I know that understanding it now doesn't fix the cost of it." She waited. "But I'm asking you to not sign them yet," he said. "I'm asking for time, not a promise, not forgiveness. Just time." Charlotte looked at her coffee cup. She turned it once in her hands, the small fidget of someone who needed something to do with her hands while she made a decision. "I've given this marriage 10 months, she said. 8 of silence and 2 of watching you show up at the kitchen table and trying to figure out if it was real. It's real. I know." She looked up at him. "That's not the question anymore. The question is whether real and too late are the same thing." She pulled her bag strap higher on her shoulder. "I have a field session this afternoon. I need to go." "Charlotte?" She stopped. "I'm not going to disappear," he said. "Whatever you decide, I'm not going to go back to what I was doing before. That's over, regardless of what you sign." He paused. "I just need you to know that." She looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then she nodded once. Not warm, not cold, not forgiving, just acknowledging. And walked past him toward the library path. He stood in the parking lot and watched her go and did not call after her because he had learned, finally, that there were things you could only demonstrate and never say. Marco was waiting at the estate when he got back. The expression on Marco's face was the one reserved for situations that had developed badly while Vincent was elsewhere, which happened occasionally and was always Marco's least favorite kind of morning. "Sit down," Marco said. "Tell me standing." "Sit down, Vincent." He sat. Marco placed a folder on the desk. Inside were financial records, internal records, the kind that didn't exist in any filing that touched legitimate operations. Transaction logs, shell account movements, numbers that had been moving in directions they should not have been moving for what the timestamps indicated was 11 months. Vincent looked at the numbers. He turned 2 pages, stopped on the 3rd. "Where did you get this?" he said. "Our forensic accounting contact flagged an anomaly in the Lakeshore property acquisition last week. We pulled the thread." Marco's voice was entirely flat. "It goes back to November." "November?" 1 month after the wedding. "How much?" Vincent said. Across all the identified accounts, 3.2 million. That we've confirmed. There may be more we haven't found yet. Vincent turned another page. The shell structure was sophisticated, not the work of someone improvising, but the work of someone who had been planning this for long enough to build real architecture around it. Someone with access to the inner operations. Someone who knew exactly which flows to touch and which to leave alone to avoid triggering the standard reviews. Someone inside. Who? He said. Marco didn't answer immediately. He placed one more document on top of the folder. A single page. A name at the top. Vincent looked at it. The name was Raymond Holt. Raymond had been with the Moreau organization for 9 years. He was 36, a second-tier operations coordinator with access to the property acquisition pipeline and the legitimizing financial layer that processed payments through the real estate holdings. He was not a lieutenant. He was not trusted at the level of Marco or Danny, but he was trusted at the level of being inside the systems, inside the flows, inside the wall that separated the Moreau operation from everyone outside it. 9 years, Vincent said. 9 years. Has he moved anything in the last week? 3 days ago. Small transfer, but the pattern is consistent. Marco straightened. He doesn't know we've found it. Vincent closed the folder. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and breathed through the specific cold that came over him when something inside his own structure had rotted without him seeing it. A cold he'd felt before, twice in 20 years, and that never got easier to feel. Bring him in, Vincent said. When? Tonight. Marco nodded and left. The confrontation happened at 9 that evening in a room at the back of a property on West Huron that the Moreau organization used for exactly this kind of conversation. A room without windows, with good soundproofing and furniture that had been chosen for utility rather than comfort. Raymond Holt arrived believing he was there for a routine check-in about a property assessment. He realized within 30 seconds of entering the room that he was not. He was a compact man, dark-haired, with a face that defaulted to pleasant, and was currently failing to maintain that default under pressure. Sweat at his collar, hands that didn't know where to put themselves. His eyes moved to the folder on the table and came back to Vincent, and he made the calculation that everyone made in this room, whether to hold the story or let it go, in about 4 seconds. He held it for approximately 90 more seconds. Then he let it go. He had been approached 14 months ago by a third party. He wouldn't give the name initially, though the name would come, who had offered him a significant sum to route specific property payments through a secondary shell structure. He had been told it was a tax efficiency arrangement, which he did not believe but accepted as the story that made it possible to do the thing while still sleeping. Over 11 months, he had made 23 transfers. He had received, in total, $400,000. Vincent listened to all of it without moving. The name, he said. Raymond told him. The name was not a name Vincent recognized, which meant it was either a genuine outside party or a name one layer removed from the person who actually gave the instruction. He looked at Marco. Marco's face said he'd had the same thought. Is that the whole name? Vincent said. That's all I have. Raymond. Vincent leaned forward slightly. I've known you for 9 years. I know your sister's name. I know what neighborhood you grew up in. I know that you have made exactly one dishonest decision in 9 years of working inside this organization, and that you are sitting here right now trying to calculate whether the person who paid you is more dangerous than I am. He stopped. That calculation has only one correct answer. Help me find the right answer. Raymond's hands were flat on the table now. He was breathing carefully. The sweat at his collar had spread. He gave a second name. Vincent recognized it immediately. The second name belonged to a man named Gerald Foss. Gerald Foss was 61, a commercial real estate attorney who had done peripheral work for the Moreau organization for 6 years. Not inside, not trusted with operational details, but proximate enough to understand the general shape of the holdings. More relevantly, Gerald Foss sat on the board of 3 companies with overlapping interests in the same South Loop development that Vincent had been negotiating for the past 8 months. The development that the property acquisitions Raymond had been routing were all connected to. Someone had been trying to destabilize the South Loop acquisition from the inside. Not to steal the money, $3.2 million was noise in the scale of what the development represented. to create traceable irregularities in the financial structure that could be surfaced at the wrong moment, to give someone leverage, to give someone a reason to come to Vincent Moreau with a problem only they could make go away. 11 months of groundwork for a pressure campaign that hadn't launched yet. Vincent sat with that for a moment. "Get me everything on Foss," he said to Marco. "Tonight." He left Raymond in the room with two of his people, so not in danger, but not leaving either, and drove back to the estate at 11:15 with his jaw set and his hands steady on the wheel and the specific cold of a man who has just discovered that someone has been building a weapon inside his house and aimed it at his future. The Foss file took Marco's team until 2 in the morning to pull together. Vincent sat in the study and read it as it came in. Property records, corporate filings, litigation history, financial relationships. The picture that assembled itself was clear enough by 1 a.m. and complete by 2. Gerald Foss was acting as a representative for a consortium of investors who wanted the South Loop development and had determined that the cleanest way to acquire it was to compromise the Moreau organization's ownership position. The traceable irregularities in the shell accounts were designed to surface through a leak to a specific federal contact at a time of the consortium's choosing, giving Vincent a choice between a quiet sale at below market value and a much more complicated conversation with people he didn't want to have conversations with. Sophisticated, patient, expensive to set up, and nearly successful. Vincent closed the last document at 2:15 and sat in the quiet study and let the full shape of it settle. Then he did something he almost never did. He called Danny. Danny picked up on the third ring, voice rough with sleep. "What happened?" "I need you here, early, 6. "Are you okay?" "I need you here at 6. Danny was there at 5:50. They worked through the morning, Vincent, Danny, Marco, and the family's legitimate legal counsel on a secured line, building the counterstructure. They had Raymond's documentation. They had the transfer records. They had the Foss connection. Used correctly, in the right sequence, with the right representation, they could flip the entire pressure campaign into an exposure risk for the consortium that would make the South Loop acquisition untouchable for anyone but the Moreau organization for the next 5 years. It was clean. It was airtight. It required executing 4 specific actions in the right order in the next 72 hours. By noon, they had the sequence mapped. By 1 o'clock, Vincent had made the first call. By 3, the second. At 4:15, he was back in the study alone when his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. He answered anyway, because the day had already been the kind of day where unanswered numbers added up badly. The voice on the other end was calm. Male. Older. The particular smooth calm of someone who believed he was still in control of a situation that had already moved past him. "Mr. Moreau, I think we should talk before this goes further." "I think," Vincent said, "you're about 48 hours too late to have a version of this conversation that goes well for you." A pause. "You're confident. I'm accurate." He kept his voice even, level. The voice he used when the decision was already made and the conversation was just the formal confirmation of it. "You built something that required 11 months and significant resources, and you built it on a man who, when given the actual choice, chose correctly. That's a foundation problem. You can't fix a foundation problem from the top." Another pause. Longer. "What do you want?" the voice said. "Nothing from you. We're past that. I'm telling you as a courtesy that you have approximately 2 business days before the documentation reaches people who will find it considerably less easy to discuss than I do." He paused. "That's not a threat. It's a schedule." He ended the call. He sat in the study for a few minutes in the late afternoon quiet. The crisis was not over. 72 hours was 72 hours and things could still move wrong, but the shape of it had changed. The pressure that had been building for 11 months inside his operation had a name and a structure and a counter now, and that was the difference between a trap and a situation. He should have felt the specific satisfaction that came with this, the clean, cold clarity of a problem identified and solved. He'd felt it before. He knew what it felt like. What he felt instead was the divorce papers still on the kitchen table. What he felt was the particular sound of a front door closing with quiet, definitive finality. He got up and walked through the house to the kitchen. The papers were there, exactly where Charlotte had left them. Rosa had moved around them all day without touching them, the way the whole household had learned to move around the things in this marriage that were not theirs to manage. Charlotte wasn't home yet. Her car wasn't in the drive. The kitchen was clean and quiet and still smelled faintly of the coffee she'd made at 7 that morning. He picked up the divorce papers. He read them through, every page, every clause. The document was thorough and fair. No spite in it, no punitive construction, just the clean administrative language of an ending. Her attorney had done good work. He set them down. He got his jacket and his keys. He drove to the Drake Hotel. He didn't call ahead. He didn't arrange anything. He drove to the hotel where they had been married 9 months ago, and he walked into the grand ballroom and he stood in the center of it. It was set up for another event. Different flowers, different arrangement of tables, nothing of their wedding remaining in the physical space. But the room was the same room. The same proportions, the same floor, the same distance between where she had stood and where he had stood, and the door he had walked through. He stood exactly where he had stood when he left her. He stood there for a long time. A hotel staff member appeared at the entrance, politely uncertain. "Sir, this room is reserved for—" "I know," he said. 5 minutes. The staff member retreated. He took out his phone. He found Charlotte's number. He looked at it for 20 seconds. Then he typed, "I need to show you something, not tonight. When you're ready, I'll be here." He put the phone in his pocket. He looked at the center of the ballroom floor, where she had stood alone in front of 400 people wearing a smile that had cost her something real. And he understood, completely, finally, without any remaining capacity for self-deception, that the worst thing he had ever done in a life that contained a significant inventory of hard decisions had nothing to do with his professional world. It was standing in this room and choosing to walk out of it. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. Charlotte had read the message. The 3 dots appeared, indicating she was typing. Then they disappeared. Then they appeared again. He stood in the empty ballroom, holding the phone with both hands, breathing in a way he hadn't breathed since he was 14 years old, and someone was telling him his parents weren't coming home, and waited for whatever she was going to say next, knowing that whatever came back would be either the last word or the first one, and that he had no leverage, no countermove, no strategic position left to operate from. He had nothing left except the truth of what he was, stripped of every wall he'd built around it. And for a man who had spent 20 years making sure that was never the case, the exposure was absolute. The 3 dots disappeared. He stood in the empty ballroom with the phone in both hands and watched the screen go still and stayed very quiet inside the particular silence of a man waiting for a verdict he has no power to influence. 30 seconds, a minute. Then her message came through. It said, "Not tonight. I have work to finish. Tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock. The kitchen." He read it twice. Not the ballroom. Not a neutral location. Not her attorney's office or a restaurant or any of the places people chose when they wanted the architecture of the space to manage the emotional temperature of a difficult conversation. The kitchen. 7 o'clock. The same time they'd been sharing breakfast for the past 3 weeks. The same table, the same chairs, the same morning light through the east windows. She was giving him the most ordinary possible version of this. He didn't know if that was mercy or the final form of her exhaustion with anything theatrical. He typed back, "I'll be there," and drove home through the city in the dark with his hand steady on the wheel and his chest doing something that didn't have a clean name. He did not sleep well. He was aware of that without examining it too closely. The ceiling of his room, the particular quality of 3 a.m., the moment at 5 when he gave up and got up and stood in the shower for longer than necessary. He was dressed and downstairs by 6:15. He made the coffee himself. He set 2 cups on the table and sat down and waited. Charlotte came down at 6:58. She was dressed for work already. Not formally, but pulled together, the way she looked when she intended to go to campus after whatever this was. She saw the 2 cups on the table. She saw him sitting with his hands around one of them. She put her bag on the counter and sat down across from him and picked up the second cup and said nothing for a moment. The morning light was doing the thing it did in July through those east windows, coming in warm and direct, putting everything in the room into a kind of high-relief clarity that was slightly merciless. Vincent looked across the table at his wife and saw the tiredness around her eyes that matched his own, and saw the stillness in her that was not detachment, but the specific stillness of a person who has decided to be present for something difficult. "I went to the Drake last night," he said. "I know. You told me. I stood where I stood when I left you." He He kept his voice level. Not managed, just honest, which felt different. I've been trying for 3 weeks to figure out how to say what I want to say without it sounding like something I rehearsed, and I can't. So I'm just going to say it plainly. She waited. I built the first 8 months of this marriage on an assumption I made before I ever spoke 10 words to you. I decided what you were before I gave you any room to be anything. I did that because it was easier than the alternative, which was letting someone into a life I'd sealed off so completely I'd stopped noticing it was sealed. He paused. I found the letters. Evelyn's desk. I know you said no 3 times. I know what you wrote in the last one. I know what it cost you to walk into this house. Charlotte's hands moved slightly on the cup. Not much, just a small shift in how she was holding it. I spent 8 months punishing you for motivations you never had, he said, and then I spent 3 weeks eating breakfast across from you like 3 weeks could balance 8 months, and you were right to put the papers on the table. You were right. The person you were protecting yourself from when you wrote those letters to Evelyn was exactly the person I turned out to be. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, somewhere on the estate grounds, a bird was doing something persistent and unconcerned with the weight of what was happening inside. I'm not asking you to tear the papers up, he said. I'm not asking you to give me another chance based on what I'm saying right now, because what I'm saying right now is cheap. Words are the cheapest thing I have. He looked at her directly. I'm asking you to give me time to show you something different, not a performance, not a campaign, just time. And if at the end of it the answer is still no, I'll sign whatever you put in front of me without making it harder than it already is. Charlotte looked at her coffee. She turned the cup once, slowly, in her hands. He had seen her do that before. The small rotation when she was processing something she wasn't ready to answer yet. He waited. He did not fill the silence. I need to tell you something, she said finally. Okay. When I came into this house, I was not in love with you. She said it plainly. No apology in it, no cruelty either, just fact. I didn't know you. What I felt was something closer to determined. I had made a promise, and I intended to keep it, and I told myself that was enough to start with. She paused. And then I spent 5 months watching you choose every single day to be absent. And something that might have become something, I felt it there, that possibility, early on, before I understood the pattern, that thing atrophied. Because things atrophy when you don't feed them. Vincent said nothing. I rebuilt myself, she continued, and I'm glad I did. I would not trade the last 4 months of my professional life for anything, including a marriage that worked. That's true, and I need you to know it's true. She looked up at him. What I'm less certain about is whether rebuilding yourself inside a marriage that failed means the marriage itself is over, or whether it means you're finally, both of you, starting from a real place instead of a constructed one. The morning light shifted fractionally, a cloud, then clear again. I didn't sign the papers either, she said. I've had them for 3 weeks and I haven't signed them. He absorbed that. Nathan asked me 2 weeks ago, she said, whether I was still married in a way that mattered to me. He wasn't making a move. He was asking as a friend because he's perceptive enough to see that I was carrying something unresolved. She looked at the table. I told him I didn't know yet. He said that not knowing yet was itself an answer of some kind. He's right, Vincent said. I know he's right. She looked up again. That's why I called my attorney and told her to hold the filing. Vincent set his cup down. He did it carefully, the way Marco had put the letters on his desk. The deliberate placement of something that required steadiness. What does that mean? He said. It means I'm not making this decision in the middle of a crisis, yours or mine. She looked at him with the same directness she'd used in the parking lot, the same clarity that had been the most consistent thing about her since October. It means I'm going to finish the survey presentation. I'm going to go to work today and come home tonight, and we're going to eat dinner, and you're going to tell me about whatever it was that had Marco at the estate at 7 in the morning, 3 days running, because I know something's been happening and you haven't said a word about it, and I am done being managed. He had not told her about Foss, about Raymond, about the 11 months of internal erosion he'd been dismantling for the past 72 hours. He had kept it separate, his instinct to contain, to handle, to solve before disclosing, the same instinct that had kept him behind glass for 20 years. There was a breach, he said. Inside the organization, someone was routing money through the property acquisition pipeline to create leverage points in the South Loop development. She listened. She did not flinch or look for an exit. He told her the shape of it. Not every operational detail, not because he was managing her, but because some details existed only to complicate, and she had asked for the truth, not the inventory. He told her about Raymond, about Foss, about the 11 months of patient construction aimed at pressuring the Moreau position in the acquisition. He told her it was being addressed, that the counterstructure was in place, that the 72-hour window was closing in his favor. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Is anyone in danger?" "No." "Are you?" The question landed differently than he expected. Not alarmed, specific. The question of someone who was asking about a person, not a situation. "No," he said again. "It's contained." She nodded. "Okay." She picked up her bag. "I'll be home by 7. She left. He sat at the kitchen table with 2 empty coffee cups and the particular quality of a morning that had not resolved the way he'd expected. Not better and not worse, but different. More honest than anything they'd managed in 10 months of marriage. He called Marco at 8 and they worked through the final sequence of the Foss counter-response through the morning. By noon, Gerald Foss's attorney had reached out to Vincent's counsel with a proposal for a structured withdrawal from the South Loop Consortium. Quiet, documented, no litigation. By 2 o'clock, the proposal had been reviewed and a counteroffer sent. By 4, it was done. The acquisition was intact. The breach was closed. Raymond Holt had been separated from the organization with terms that reflected both the severity of what he had done and the fact that he'd cooperated fully. Vincent was precise about that balance. Marco came to the estate at 5 to review the final documents. He sat across from Vincent in the study and looked at the signed agreements and then looked at Vincent and said, "You handled that well." "We handled it." "You made the right calls in the right order." Marco set the papers down. "The Foss Consortium will look for another position. They always do. But not here, and not soon." "I know." Marco looked at him for a moment with the evaluative attention of someone who had been reading this particular face for a long time. "And the other thing? She's coming home at 7. That's not what I asked." "I know." Vincent looked at the window. "I told her about Foss, the shape of it." Marco was quiet for a moment. "That's new." "Yes." "Good new or I don't know yet." Vincent turned back from the window. "But it was the right call." Marco picked up his papers and his jacket and moved to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. "Your grandmother's been asking for you," he said. "The hospital called this morning. She's had a better few days. She's awake more." "I'll go tomorrow." "Take Charlotte," Marco said, and left before Vincent could respond. She came home at 6:50. She put her bag down, changed out of her work clothes, and came to the kitchen where Vincent was finishing the dinner he'd told Rosa to leave to him. Pasta, nothing architectural, the kind of thing he'd watched Rosa make enough times to approximate on a night when approximation was what he had. Charlotte came in, looked at the stove, looked at him, and said nothing. She got 2 glasses and poured water and set them on the table and sat down. They ate dinner. The conversation moved slowly and then less slowly. She told him about the survey, 3 days from the presentation, the grant deadline, Nathan's structural report coming in that afternoon, and being exactly what they needed. He told her about the Foss resolution. More detail this time. She asked good questions, specific questions, the kind that showed she'd been thinking about what he'd told her that morning rather than setting it aside. At one point she said, "Do you enjoy it? The legitimate side, the real estate, the development work?" He thought about it. "Yes, more than the rest of it." "I know." She looked at her glass. "You're good at it. Marco told me once, early on when I asked him about you because you weren't going to tell me anything yourself. He said the development work was where you were actually building something instead of just defending it." Marco said that. Marco says a lot of things when he thinks it matters. She looked up. "He was trying to give me something to hold on to. I think he felt bad about the way the first months went." Vincent looked at the table. "He should have felt bad about me." "He did," she said it simply. "That was obvious. After dinner, she made tea and he stayed at the table and they talked for another hour. Not about the marriage, not about the papers, not about the architecture of where they were or what came next. About her research. About a building on West Monroe that might be the oldest extant example of a specific construction technique in the city. About what it meant to preserve something not because it was beautiful, but because it was true. Because it was what had actually happened, in actual materials, in an actual place. He found, somewhere in that hour, that he was not managing the conversation, not angling it, not keeping one part of himself behind the glass. He was just there. At 9:30, she said, "I want to visit Evelyn." He looked at her. "Tomorrow," she said. "If that's all right. If she's well enough." Marco said she's been better the last few days. Then tomorrow. She held the tea mug with both hands. She's going to ask me how I am, and I'm going to have to tell her the truth, which is complicated, so I'd rather go in knowing what the truth is. She looked at him. "Can we agree on what the truth is?" "What do you want it to be?" She was quiet for a moment. "I want it to be that we're trying. Not performing trying, actually trying, which means you tell me things when things happen, and I don't manage my own life in a separate compartment inside this house, and neither of us pretends we're further along than we are." "Yes," he said. "That's the truth." She nodded once, put her mug in the sink. "Good night, Vincent." "Good night." She went upstairs. He sat at the kitchen table alone for a while, not thinking particularly hard about anything, just present in the room. The kitchen was clean and quiet and smelled like the dinner he'd cooked and the tea she'd made and the faint outdoors smell that came through the window over the sink when the summer evening was the right temperature. He got up and turned off the light and went to bed. He slept. They drove to Northwestern Memorial the next morning after breakfast. The drive was 40 minutes, and they talked some and were quiet some. And the quiet was different from every other quiet they'd shared in 10 months. Not loaded, not managed, just two people in a car comfortable enough with the space between them to let it be. Evelyn was awake. She was in the bed with 3 pillows behind her and a novel she wasn't reading open on her lap and her eyes sharp as they'd ever been. She looked at Vincent when he came in. She looked at Charlotte behind him. Something moved across her face. Not surprise, not relief, something more specific and quieter than either. "Sit down," she said. "Both of you. You're making me anxious standing in the doorway." They sat. Vincent in the chair he usually took. Charlotte in a second chair she pulled close to the bed without being asked. Evelyn looked at Charlotte for a long moment. "You look tired," she said. "I am tired," Charlotte said. "It's been a complicated few months." "I know." Evelyn's voice was gentler than usual. "I owe you an apology." Charlotte shook her head. "You don't." "I pushed too hard." "You asked." "I made my own choice." Charlotte's voice was steady. "You didn't force anything. You just loved us both enough to think we might be good for each other, and the evidence on that is still coming in." Evelyn looked at her for a moment more. Then she looked at Vincent. "You found the letters," she said. "Marco found them." "That's the same thing." She adjusted the novel on her lap. "And?" "And I understood some things I should have understood 10 months ago." "Better late than permanently stupid," she said, which was so precisely Evelyn that Charlotte made a sound that was not quite a laugh but close enough to one. They stayed for 2 hours. Evelyn tired toward the end, not dramatically, just visibly, the conversation slowing to shorter exchanges. And Charlotte read to her for the last 20 minutes from the novel she hadn't been reading, while Vincent sat in the chair and watched his grandmother listen to his wife's voice with her eyes closed and the first completely unguarded expression he'd seen on her face in a long time. When they left, in the elevator going down, Charlotte said, "She's smaller than she used to be." "I know. She loves you very much." "I know that too." The elevator reached the ground floor. They walked out through the lobby into July. Warm, bright city noise filtering in from the street. Charlotte stopped on the sidewalk. She looked at the front of the building for a moment, then at the street, then at him. "I'm not tearing the papers up," she said. "Not yet. I need more time than 3 weeks of breakfast to trust this." "I know. But I'm not filing them either." She looked at him with the same direct clarity that had been there since the parking lot, since the kitchen, since the ballroom message, since every moment she had been more honest with him than he'd deserved. "What I'm doing is choosing to be here. Not because of obligation. Not because of Evelyn. Because I'm choosing it. She paused. That's what I came in with 10 months ago, except then I was choosing in the dark. Now I'm choosing with my eyes open, knowing exactly what I'm working with. Which includes the fact that you are a difficult, sealed-off, occasionally impossible man who is also apparently capable of cooking pasta and sitting in the back of a lecture hall for 45 minutes without announcing himself. He said nothing for a moment, then, the pasta was acceptable at best. It was fine. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, something adjacent to it, something that had its own weight and its own history. Don't oversell it. They walked to the car. The survey presentation happened on a Thursday morning 2 weeks later in a conference room at the Landmarks Preservation Council offices on North Wells. Charlotte and Nathan presented to a room of 12 council members, grant committee representatives, 2 city planning officials. The presentation ran 75 minutes. The structural component Nathan had built was exactly what she'd said it would be. Thorough, precise, the kind of work that made the historical argument land with material authority. The grant was approved the same afternoon. Charlotte called Vincent from the car outside the building. He picked up on the second ring. She told him, and there was a silence on his end that lasted about 3 seconds. The kind of silence that in anyone else would have been nothing. And in Vincent Moreau, she had learned to read as something he was feeling that he hadn't found the right shape for yet. Good, he said. That's it? Good? That's very good. That's excellent work. Nathan says we should celebrate. He's suggesting dinner. You should go. She paused. You could come. Another brief silence. You sure? I'm asking, aren't I? They had dinner at a restaurant on Randolph. Charlotte, Nathan, Nathan's associate, and Vincent, who sat at a table with an architect he'd had investigated 4 weeks ago, and shook the man's hand and ate a decent meal and listened to 2 people talk about the structural idiosyncrasies of pre-1880 commercial construction with a fluency he didn't share but could follow if he paid attention. Nathan was exactly what the file had described: precise, intelligent, easy with people without being performing easy. And he treated Charlotte's expertise with the kind of unguarded respect that Vincent recognized, watching from across the table, as the thing that had meant most to her in the 4 months they'd been collaborating. Not attraction. Respect. Genuine and unpretentious. Nathan looked at Vincent once, midway through dinner, with the specific look of a man who understands the full dimension of a situation without requiring anyone to explain it to him, and nodded slightly, and went back to his food. Vincent understood what the nod meant. He accepted it for what it was. Walking back to their cars after dinner, Nathan fell briefly into step with Charlotte, while Vincent gave them 30 feet of space without being asked to. He couldn't hear what Nathan said. He saw Charlotte nod. He saw Nathan put his hand briefly on her shoulder, the gesture of someone who is releasing something gracefully, with full intention, because grace is what the moment requires. Nathan said goodnight to them both and drove away. Charlotte stood on the sidewalk and watched his car go. He's a good person, she said. I know. She looked at him. You're not going to be weird about this? I'm going to try not to be weird about this. That's honest. I'm working on honest. She almost smiled, the same adjacency as before, the thing that had its own history in it, that wasn't performed and wasn't practiced and was therefore more valuable than any other expression she had. They drove home separately. She was 10 minutes behind him. She'd stopped for something. He didn't ask what. He got to the estate first, changed clothes, turned on the lights in the kitchen the way she liked them. He made tea because she usually had tea in the evening now, and he'd started keeping track of the small things not as a campaign, but because paying attention had become the thing he did. She came in at 10. She set her bag down. She saw the tea. She sat at the table and picked it up and looked at him across the kitchen the way she'd looked at him across 100 different silences in 10 months of marriage. I want to tell you something, she said. Okay. When I was writing that third letter to Evelyn, the one where I said yes, I was sitting at my desk in my apartment in Hyde Park, and it was 2 a.m, and I was exhausted and scared, and I wrote that sentence about being afraid I would convince myself that not being wanted was what I deserved. She held the mug. I meant it when I wrote it, and then I moved in here, and somewhere around month 4, I started to convince myself exactly that. I started to shrink. I started to accept the silence as the correct expectation. She looked at him steadily. And then I got angry. Not at you, at myself, for starting to believe it. And that anger was the thing that saved me. He said nothing. He let it be what it was. I'm telling you this, she said, because I need you to understand that the version of me that's sitting here right now is not the version who needed saving. She already saved herself. She set the mug down. What I'm deciding, what I'm in the process of deciding, is whether I want to share the life I built with someone who finally learned how to see it. And that's a different question than the one I came in with. Yes, he said. It is. I need you to understand the difference. I do. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that the kitchen clock registered in the background and the house settled around them the way old houses settle, all the particular sounds of a building that has held more than one kind of life inside it. Okay, she said. She picked up her tea and went to the window and stood there for a moment looking at the garden in the dark, the stone bench, the east wall, the particular stillness of the estate at 10 on a summer night. The garden could use some work, she said. Tell me what it needs. I'll show you, not tonight. She turned from the window. This weekend. Okay? She put her mug in the sink and went upstairs. 3 weeks later, Evelyn Moreau died on a Sunday morning with the light coming through the north window of her room and Vincent sitting beside her bed and Charlotte on the other side holding her hand. She went quietly and without drama, in the way of people who have already said the things that needed saying and arranged the world, as best they could, the way they wanted to leave it. They drove back to the estate in the early afternoon and Charlotte made lunch, something simple, and they ate it at the kitchen table and didn't talk much and didn't need to. In the weeks that followed, Vincent found that grief had a specific texture, not the overwhelming flood he'd expected because Evelyn had been dying for months, and some of the grief had already been absorbed in installments. What remained was quieter, a chair at the table that stayed empty. The particular absence of a voice that had been the most reliable fixed point of his life for 20 years. Charlotte understood loss. She didn't try to explain it to him or organize it or make it smaller. She sat with him in it the way she sat with everything, present, unhurried, not requiring it to be anything other than what it was. They signed the paperwork to maintain the foundation in Evelyn's name. Charlotte agreed to serve on the board. It wasn't discussed at length. It was the obvious thing, and they were both gradually getting better at doing the obvious thing without requiring a formal negotiation around it. On a morning in early September, the light through the kitchen windows was the particular gold of a season changing, cooler than August, cleaner, with the quality of air that had given up trying to be summer and was starting to be something else. Charlotte came downstairs at 7 and found Vincent already at the table with 2 cups. She sat down. She picked up her cup and held it with both hands the way she always did in the first 10 minutes of the morning, before the day had fully assembled itself. They sat in the quiet. Outside the window, the garden that they'd spent 3 weekends in August working through was doing something different than it had been doing before. Less overgrown at the edges, the stone bench visible now from the kitchen in a way it hadn't been when she'd first pointed to it and said it could use some work. She hadn't signed the divorce papers. She hadn't torn them up either. They were in the top drawer of her desk in the East Wing study, and they sat there the way certain things sit. Not forgotten, not ignored, but no longer urgent. No longer the shape of the question. The question had changed. It had gotten smaller and more specific and more real. Not whether the marriage was over. Whether 2 people who had come into a room as strangers, one of them running and one of them standing still, could do the daily, unspectacular, undramatic work of becoming something to each other. He refilled her cup without being asked. She moved her chair slightly, not much, just the small shift of someone adjusting to the space they're actually in rather than the space they've been holding themselves back from. Neither of them said anything. The morning came in through the east windows the way it always did, indifferent to the history of the room it was lighting, and the 2 people sitting in it chose, without announcement, without ceremony, without any language at all, to be exactly where they were. That was enough. That was, it turned out, the whole thing.